At 17, Wilfred Benítez became boxing's youngest world champion ever. They said he could see punches before they were thrown, but no one saw what was coming for him. He fought legends and made history, destined for greatness. Then his reflexes slowed, his brilliance faded, and behind closed doors, he began battling something tragic that would haunt him forever. This is how a boxing prodigy went from the top of the world to being almost completely forgotten. The peak of his career. Before the tragedy that would define his life forever and the heartbreaking silence that would follow it, Wilfred Benítez was actually something extremely rare. He was a teenage boxing genius with a mind like a radar and the reflexes of a cat. In the world of boxing, many have power, many have speed, but very few have the kind of natural instinct that Benítez possessed. Wilfred Benítez earned the nickname El Radar because it seemed like he could read his opponents' minds. Before their punches even landed, he had already slipped away, tilted his head just an inch, or spun out of danger. His ability to anticipate punches wasn't just remarkable, it was otherworldly. Fans and commentators watched in disbelief as world-class opponents swung and missed over and over again, as if chasing shadows, while Benítez stayed calm, eyes sharp, and always calculating. At just 17 years old, he did the impossible. Benítez became the youngest world champion in boxing history. That moment, when he claimed the World Boxing Association light welterweight title by defeating Antonio Cervantes, shocked the world. This wasn't just a young fighter winning a lucky match. Benítez completely outclassed a seasoned and feared champion. He was a teenager, but his boxing skills were decades ahead of his age, and that was only the beginning. Benítez would go on to win world titles in 3 different weight divisions, including light welterweight, welterweight, and light middleweight. These weren't easy victories against soft competition. He faced the very best fighters of his era, men with granite chins, deadly punches, and iron wills, and he beat them. One of his most defining wins came against Carlos Palomino, a strong and respected welterweight champion. In that 1979 fight, Benítez displayed everything that made him special. He danced, he dodged, and he punished. In short, his defense looked effortless. He made Palomino miss so often that even the crowd started gasping in disbelief. By the end of the night, there was no doubt that Benítez had outboxed the champion and taken the World Boxing Council welterweight title. But if you ask most boxing fans to name his most memorable moment, many would point to his legendary clash with Sugar Ray Leonard in 1979. This was no ordinary bout. It was 2 quick and intelligent masters of the sport, each trying to outthink the other in real time. The fight became a chess match, with punches instead of pawns. Even though Benítez eventually lost by a late stoppage in the 15th round, he gained respect for the way he fought Leonard. And in the end, he made the future superstar work harder than he ever had before. That fight showed the world just how sharp, smart, and skilled Wilfred Benítez truly was. And then came his 1982 battle with Roberto Duran, one of the fiercest fighters of all time. While Duran was known for his power and relentless style, Benítez kept him off balance with his precision and technique. But he didn't just survive the match, he actually won. That victory made him a 3-division world champion, placing him among the boxing elite. At the height of his powers, Benítez was untouchable. He was one of the greatest defensive fighters the sport had ever seen. He didn't need to take punishment to prove his toughness. He let his movement do the talking. His style was smooth, almost too beautiful to watch. Fans would lean forward in their seats, knowing they were witnessing someone rare who made boxing look easy. But what they couldn't see was that behind the dazzling displays and historic wins, something was slowly changing. The signs were there. His movements, once so fast and fluid, started to slow just a bit. His defense, once perfect, began to show cracks. The radar wasn't broken, but it was flickering. And it wasn't long before something inside Benítez began to break. The downfall begins. At one point, Wilfred Benítez was untouchable. But in boxing, greatness has an expiration date, and for Benítez, the decline came faster than anyone ever expected. He was still young and still fighting at the championship level when something began to shift. The moves that once came naturally began to slow, and the confidence that once radiated from him in the ring began to flicker. Sadly, the beginning of the end for Benítez was already in motion, and soon the world would see it. One of the biggest turning points in his career came during his much-anticipated fight against Sugar Ray Leonard in 1979. Although it was a respectable performance, Benítez lost by a 15th-round technical knockout. At the time, many blamed it on Leonard's brilliance. But boxing insiders started to whisper that Benítez had looked a little different in that fight, not just physically, but mentally. He wasn't as aggressive as he used to be, and his timing was just a bit off. The whispers grew louder when Benítez faced Thomas the Hitman Hearns in 1983. By then, fans had begun to notice the sad reality that boxing analysts had already observed. Benítez was no longer the elusive genius he once was. Against Hearns, he looked flat, uninspired, and hesitant. This wasn't the Wilfred Benítez who used to frustrate world champions with ease. This version stood still too long, took too many punches, and gave too few answers. He lost by unanimous decision, and the defeat felt heavier than the scorecards showed. In fact, after the Hearns fight, the Washington Post said Benítez lacked aggression and sleepwalked through the early rounds, taking more punishment. That kind of description was unheard of for a fighter once celebrated for his sharp instincts and fast reactions. But by this point, even the press couldn't ignore what was happening. His body was still in the ring, but his mind seemed elsewhere. As his performance declined, so did the support around him. Behind the scenes, Benítez was facing problems that went far beyond boxing gloves and judges' scorecards. He began dealing with injuries, some visible, many hidden. He had taken thousands of punches over his career, many of them subtle but damaging, and each one had a cost. He also suffered from increasing tension with promoters and managers who often failed to act in his best interest. In a sport notorious for broken contracts and shady deals, Benítez found himself caught in the chaos. But perhaps one problem that would go on to deeply affect Benítez was the fact that he never had strong financial guidance, and his management team was inconsistent at best and exploitative at worst. Over the years, disputes over fight money, training decisions, and healthcare chipped away at his stability. The same people who once celebrated him now seemed more concerned with squeezing a few more fights and a few more paychecks out of him. And through it all, Benítez kept going. He took more fights, even when his body and reflexes told him to stop. He changed weight classes. He moved cities. But nothing seemed to work. He was still a big name, but the fear he once put into opponents was gone. Fighters who once would have ducked him were now lining up, eager to take on the fallen star. What made this downfall even more tragic was the contrast. Just a few years earlier, Wilfred Benítez had stood shoulder to shoulder with the greatest boxers in the world. He was a champion in 3 weight divisions. He had beaten legends, but now he was slipping fast. To make matters worse, his career earnings, which ran into millions of dollars over the years, were vanishing just as quickly as his speed. But no one could have predicted just how far the fall would go. Because while his losses in the ring were painful, what happened outside the ring would be far more devastating. Benítez's financial challenges. By the time Wilfred Benítez retired from professional boxing in 1990, he had fought 62 times and had faced some of the most legendary names in the sport. He had traveled the world, headlined major events, and at one point earned massive purses that should have secured his future. But when the spotlight faded, Benítez found himself in a far more brutal fight than he could ever have imagined. Unlike many boxing legends who go on to live in comfort, give interviews from mansions, or work as trainers and commentators, Benítez's post-boxing life was filled with struggle. The money was gone, the contracts were history, and the promoters, managers, and even so-called friends who had once surrounded him were nowhere to be found. Benítez's financial challenges weren't just unfortunate, they were severe. After years of fame and global success, he was left with almost nothing. There were no lucrative endorsement deals, no television commentary gigs, and no gym chain with his name on it. For a man who had achieved so much inside the ring, the outside world offered no safety net. At one point, Benítez was reportedly living on a modest monthly pension of just $1,100, with no savings account or no investment portfolio. In fact, this check was barely enough to cover basic living expenses, and they couldn't even afford to repair their plumbing or pay their water and electric bills. For someone who once earned six-figure paydays, this reality was not just heartbreaking, it was humiliating. The worst part was the fact that he wasn't wasting his money on luxury. There were no exotic cars or flashy real estate. Most of Benítez's money had simply been lost to bad deals, poor management, legal disputes, and the often corrupt underbelly of the boxing world. Unlike other fighters who had solid teams behind them or financial advisors guiding their careers, Benítez was left exposed. He never had the infrastructure to protect his wealth. He wasn't just failed by his own decisions, he was failed by the people around him. And yet, Benítez never complained publicly or called anyone out. And so, while other fighters from his era received awards, tributes, and Hall of Fame praise, Benítez was barely mentioned. Of course, his name was remembered by die-hard fans, but for the most part, he faded into the background. It was as if the sport had chosen to forget him, even after everything he gave to it. But his financial struggles were just one part of the picture. As difficult as it was to survive on so little money, what made it worse was what was happening to his body and mind. His health was crumbling, and he could no longer do the one thing he had always counted on: the devastating health battle. If losing fame and fortune was hard, what came next for Wilfred Benítez was far more devastating. Because as the money dried up and the crowd stopped cheering, his body, and more painfully, his mind, began to break down. The same gifts that had once made him a world champion, like his sharp brain, his ability to read opponents, anticipate punches, and think 2 steps ahead, was now fading, day by day. By the time he was in his late 30s, just a few short years after retirement, signs of serious cognitive decline had begun to appear. He would forget things, zone out mid-conversation, and could no longer speak properly. His reactions became delayed, and at first, it seemed like fatigue, or perhaps stress. But the symptoms worsened. Doctors later confirmed what many had feared. Wilfred Benítez was suffering from a degenerative brain condition caused by years of repeated head trauma in the ring. The condition is known as post-traumatic encephalopathy, a form of chronic brain damage also referred to today as chronic traumatic encephalopathy. It's a disease commonly seen in athletes who've taken repeated blows to the head. For Benítez, it was especially cruel, because no matter how skilled his defense had once been, no fighter walks away untouched. Benítez had 62 professional bouts, thousands of rounds in training camps, and countless sparring sessions with multiple jabs, crosses, and uppercuts. And sadly, the result was irreversible. As his condition progressed, he lost the ability to care for himself. His brain no longer communicated clearly with his body. He began slurring his words. He had difficulty forming sentences. He would forget who people were. In fact, he wouldn't even remember parts of his own legendary career. Eventually, he became bedridden. His once strong frame, honed by years of intense physical discipline, became frail and stiff. He could no longer walk on his own, no longer dress himself, shower, or feed himself. For a man who had once stood proudly in the center of boxing rings all over the world, it was a heartbreaking transformation. When his condition worsened, his mother, Clara, stepped in as his full-time caregiver. Day after day, she bathed him, fed him, changed his clothes, gave him his medication, and stayed by his side. They could not afford nurses, a team of doctors, a medical fund, or professional assistants, and so it was down to just his family caring for him. Clara devoted her life to his care. She often told reporters that she didn't do it out of obligation, but out of love. For years, she fought to keep him as comfortable and stable as possible, even as her own health began to decline. At some point, she began to worry about what would happen to Benítez after her passing, and she expressed this worry to his older sister Yvonne, who promised to step in. After Clara's death, Yvonne took over his caregiving responsibilities. She continued what their mother had started by protecting him, comforting him, feeding him, and helping him get through the day. The burden was enormous, physically and emotionally, but the family never abandoned him. They stood by him, even when the world had forgotten. And while his condition stabilized at times, it never improved. In fact, it got worse. By the 2000s, visitors to his modest home in Puerto Rico would find a man who could no longer speak full sentences. He could still manage a faint smile or nod to a familiar voice, but the flowing conversations, the wit, the rhythm that once defined him, all of it had vanished. The man who once outsmarted the greatest boxers in the world could now barely string together a thought. News outlet, Chicago, visited Benítez for an in-depth documentary about his later life, and after the visit, their publication read, "Wilfred registers no reaction, other than to look in the direction of his big sister's voice. He cannot speak. He cannot walk. He wears a diaper because he cannot control his bodily functions. A tube protrudes from his belly because he cannot feed himself." His world became small. Most days were spent in a bed or in a wheelchair. Television, music, and short visits from family were the only stimulation. He could no longer read or write or go outside on his own. And certainly, he couldn't work. Any hope of a second act, whether as a coach, analyst, or mentor, was no longer possible. In interviews, his family shared how painful it was to watch someone once so full of life deteriorate, not just physically, but mentally. To see him try to speak, only to forget the words. To see him smile at familiar faces, then blink in confusion moments later. It was as if a piece of him faded each year, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. As the years went on, his health continued to deteriorate. The disease took more of his strength, his energy, and more parts of his memory. He spent birthdays and holidays confined to a bed. And while his family loved him dearly, they often struggled to find the resources to give him the care he truly needed. But the tragedy of Wilfred Benítez's life wasn't just in the fall. It was in the silence that followed. And even then, the story wasn't over. Forgotten, but not gone. Today, Wilfred Benítez is still alive, but what that life looks like is far from what anyone would expect for a 3-time world champion. He lives quietly, tucked away in a modest home in Chicago, far removed from the roaring stadiums, flashing cameras, and championship belts that once defined him. And perhaps the most heartbreaking part of his story isn't what he lost, but how easily the world let him slip away. After his mother, Clara, passed away in 2008, the last real pillar holding up his fragile world was gone. She had been his caretaker, his nurse, and his defender. She shielded him from the worst of his condition and gave him love when everything else was failing. Her passing wasn't just a personal loss, it was a shift, and everything became harder after that. His sister, Yvonne, stepped in with no fortune, no celebrity support, and very limited means. However, she made a choice to dedicate her life to keeping her brother safe. And that's exactly what she's done. Yvonne has been open about the financial strain. They live on little. There are months when food is tight and medical expenses become overwhelming. Sadly, government support is very minimal. And donations from fans when they come are modest and sporadic. The millions of dollars Wilfred once earned during his career are long gone, and in their place are old photos, some faded newspaper clippings, and his family's quiet love. But what hurts most is the silence from the very sport that once celebrated him. It seems like the boxing world that raised him up, placed him on a pedestal, and called him a prodigy has largely moved on. There have been some gestures here and there, like a few tributes and some fundraisers, but not the kind of enduring support you'd expect for someone who gave everything to the sport. Wilfred Benítez wasn't just a champion. He was the youngest world title holder in boxing history. He fought the best of his era. He made history, inspired generations, and carried the pride of Puerto Rico on his shoulders. Yet now, in his final chapters, he lives in obscurity, forgotten by many and remembered by few. What's worse is that his condition means he can't speak out for himself. He can't demand justice or advocate for other fighters going through the same thing. His silence is not a choice, it's a symptom. And in that silence, the boxing world has found it easy to look the other way. In 1996, the World Boxing Council honored Benítez by inducting him into the International Boxing Hall of Fame. It was a touching moment, but it was bittersweet. Because by then, he was already suffering from the effects of his health problems. The crowd cheered as the announcer listed his accomplishments, but it was clear that the man who was supposed to receive the honor was no longer the fighter they once knew. But his story should never be ignored. Because Wilfred's life is a brutal reminder of what the sport can take. The glamour eventually fades, and the lights go out. But for many fighters, there's nothing waiting on the other side of glory. There's no pension, no health insurance, and no safety net. Benítez's life today serves as a powerful, painful warning that you can be the best in the world and still end up forgotten. You can give the sport your youth, your body, and your mind, yet still be left with nothing. Wilfred Benítez didn't choose this ending. No one would. But in his vulnerability, in the love that surrounds him despite the hardship, there's still a kind of dignity. A reminder that greatness doesn't always vanish. Sometimes it just lies quietly in a back room, away from the cameras, waiting to be remembered. His story isn't just a tragedy. It's a call to do better, to care more, and to never forget the people who gave everything for a moment of glory. Wilfred Benítez may live in silence, but his life still speaks volumes. What was your favorite Wilfred Benítez match? Tell us in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.